My sister sold her house for a luxury vacation. Now my parents expect me to take her in. Hello, read it. I was never the favorite child. That much was clear from the beginning, though my parents would never admit it. They had a way of disguising favoritism behind polite neutrality, behind carefully chosen words and subtle shifts in tone. They played the game well, never outright declaring their preference, but ensuring I always felt its weight. It wasn't that they didn't love me. I was their daughter, after all. But love and preference are two different things, and in our house, preference belonged solely to my younger sister, Vanessa. I'm Evelyn, 36 years old, single, independent, practical, the kind of person who doesn't expect life to hand them anything on a silver platter. I worked for everything I have, every dime in my savings account, every inch of my house, every bit of stability I've built brick by brick over the years. I take comfort in structure, in knowing that the choices I make today won't come back to haunt me tomorrow. Vanessa, on the other hand, has always lived her life like a gust of wind. Wild, unpredictable, impossible to catch. She's 31 now, married, with 2 kids. But if you met her, you'd think she was still a teenager, wrapped up in the illusion that life is a thrilling adventure where responsibility is optional. From the time we were young, she was always the bold one, the risk-taker, the kind of person who jumped without checking if there was something to catch her. And, conveniently, there always was. My parents were her safety net, stretching themselves thin time and time again to ensure she never had to suffer the consequences of her own recklessness. They made excuses when she got in trouble at school, smoothed things over when she made impulsive decisions, bailed her out of every financial misstep. She was their golden child, their wildflower who needed to be nurtured, not reprimanded. I, on the other hand, was the responsible one, the one who could take care of herself. I didn't get the same indulgences Vanessa did. If I made a mistake, I was expected to fix it. If I needed help, I was reminded of my independence. It was an unspoken rule in our family. Vanessa needed them. I didn't. I resented it for years. And then, eventually, I stopped expecting anything different. Life moved on. I built my career, saved my money, bought my house, a modest but comfortable home that belonged to no one but me. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine. Every inch of it was a reflection of the sacrifices I had made, the hard work I had put in. I was proud of it in a way Vanessa could never understand. Meanwhile, she continued on her path, always chasing something new. A new passion, a new experience, a new dream that changed every year. When she got married to Damien, I had a brief moment of hope that maybe, just maybe, she would finally settle down. That maybe responsibility would finally sink its teeth into her. It didn't. My parents gifted her and Damien a house shortly after their wedding, a generous down payment that made it possible for them to own a home they otherwise could never have afforded. Vanessa loved it at first. She decorated it with trendy furniture, filled it with souvenirs from weekend trips she and Damien took, hosted dinner parties where she gushed about how much she adored being a homeowner. But the shine wore off quickly. Vanessa was never meant for stability. The idea of spending the next few decades in one place felt suffocating to her. And so, when the latest obsession took hold, a dream of traveling the world, of taking her children on an endless adventure, she didn't hesitate. She sold the house, not to downsize, not to invest, not to be practical. She sold it because the idea of spending her life in one place felt like a prison sentence. Because she wanted the thrill of the unknown, the excitement of hopping from one country to another, of living a life that looked glamorous on social media. I didn't say anything when I heard the news. I had learned, long ago, that my opinion didn't matter when it came to Vanessa's decisions. My parents were over the moon, gushing about her bravery, her spirit, her ability to embrace life fully. They framed it as an act of courage, not recklessness. And for a while, it seemed like Vanessa had gotten exactly what she wanted. Her social media was filled with snapshots of sunlit beaches, ancient cities, mountaintop views. Pictures of her and Damien sipping wine in Italy, of her children running through fields of wildflowers in Switzerland, of 5-star resorts and lavish meals. She made it look effortless, like a fairy tale come to life. But fairy tales aren't real. The money ran out. I saw the cracks forming before anyone else did. The posts became less extravagant, the destinations less impressive. There was no more fine dining, no more luxury resorts. The excitement in her captions turned into something else, something forced, something desperate. My parents, who had cheered her on at every turn, started to sound worried. And then the inevitable happened. Vanessa and Damien had burned through everything. The house was gone. The savings were gone. The dream was gone. There was nowhere left to go. And now my parents had a problem. They had spent so much helping Vanessa that they had nothing left to offer. They couldn't buy her another house. They couldn't wave a magic wand and fix the mess she had created. But there was still one person in the family with a stable life. Me. I didn't hear it from Vanessa first. She was too proud for that. Instead, it was my mother who called, her voice dripping with the kind of forced sweetness that always meant she wanted something. She eased into it, framing it as a simple, obvious solution. Vanessa and her family needed a place to stay. And since I had a house with extra space, no husband, no children, it only made sense that I opened my doors to them. After all, family takes care of each other. That's what family does. Fairness. That's the word she used. As if fairness had ever applied to me. I sat there after the call, staring at the walls of the home I had built, feeling the weight of an expectation I had never agreed to carry. Vanessa had thrown everything away for a dream, and now, somehow, it had become my responsibility to fix it. But this time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to. The weight of expectation had always been a familiar presence in my life, lingering just beneath the surface, never spoken outright, but always there. When my mother first called me with the news about Vanessa's situation, I had expected the usual dance, her coaxing voice, the carefully framed words that would make my refusal feel like an act of cruelty. I had heard it all before, each conversation laced with the same undercurrent. Vanessa needed help. Vanessa was struggling. Vanessa was not equipped to handle the consequences of her own choices. And I, being the responsible one, the stable one, the one who never needed rescuing, was supposed to be the solution. It had been the same pattern since childhood, and I had long since grown weary of it. But this time, I told myself I would not be pulled into it. This time, I would hold my ground. The first few days after her call were filled with a tension I couldn't shake. I told myself I had done the right thing by saying no. Vanessa had made her choice. She had taken the life my parents had handed her, a house, a stable future, security, and had thrown it away for an illusion. She had sold her home, spent the money on a fantasy, and now, when reality had finally caught up to her, she expected someone else to pick up the pieces. But I wasn't going to be that person. Not this time. Yet something didn't feel right. My mother, relentless as she was when it came to Vanessa, had suddenly stopped calling. There were no follow-up messages, no attempts to guilt-trip me further, no updates on Vanessa's situation. The silence unsettled me. I knew my parents too well. I knew their habit of bending over backward for my sister, of exhausting every possible resource to make sure she never had to face discomfort. If they weren't pressuring me anymore, it could only mean one thing. They had come up with a different plan. I wasn't expecting to hear the truth from my neighbor. Mrs. Calloway was one of those women who knew everything that happened on our street. She had lived there for decades, seen families come and go, witnessed every triumph and scandal that unfolded behind closed doors. When she stopped me outside my house one morning, I had assumed it would be the usual idle small talk, the kind I nodded along to without paying much attention. But then she mentioned Vanessa. It took me a moment to register what she was saying. Vanessa and her family had moved into my parents' house. The words didn't quite sink in at first. It wasn't possible. My parents' home was small, barely large enough for the two of them, let alone 4 more people. There was no guest room, no spare space. The idea of Vanessa, Damien, and their 2 children squeezing into that cramped house seemed absurd. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. My parents, desperate to save Vanessa from facing the consequences of her decisions, had taken them in. It was the only logical explanation. I called my mother as soon as I got inside, the phone barely ringing before she picked up. Her voice was light, breezy, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Yes, Vanessa and Damien had moved in. Yes, it was a bit tight, but they were making it work. It was only temporary, she said, just until Vanessa and Damien figured things out. The words felt rehearsed, as if she had anticipated my reaction, as if she was already preparing to push for something more. I should have felt relieved. After all, this meant I wasn't their first choice after all. They had found another solution, one that didn't involve invading my space or disrupting my life. But the relief didn't last. Something gnawed at me, a quiet unease I couldn't shake. My parents' house was not a long-term solution. It was a stopgap, a temporary arrangement that would, inevitably, become unsustainable. 2 weeks passed in uneasy silence. I didn't ask for updates, and my parents didn't offer them. But I knew, deep down, that the situation was unraveling. It was only a matter of time before the call started again. And when my mother finally did call, her voice had changed. The forced optimism was gone, replaced with something heavier. The strain was evident now, impossible to hide. The house was too small. The children were restless. Vanessa was growing irritable. Damien was short-tempered. The chaos was unbearable, and my parents, who had spent decades living in quiet routine, were struggling under the weight of it. They had done what they always did, taken Vanessa in, shielded her from the full force of her mistakes, but they had underestimated how much they would have to sacrifice in the process. I knew what was coming before she even said it. They couldn't keep this up. Vanessa and her family needed more space. They needed stability, and my house, with its extra rooms and quiet atmosphere, was the obvious solution. My mother didn't frame it as a request. She framed it as necessity, a duty, a responsibility. I refused before she could even finish. I told her I couldn't do it, that I wouldn't. There was no hesitation in my voice this time, no crack in my resolve. I braced myself for the usual guilt-tripping, for the carefully chosen words that would make me feel like the selfish one. But instead, my mother went silent, the kind of silence that made my stomach twist in warning. And then, she told me the truth. My father was sick. Not a cold, not something temporary. Something worse. Something they had known about for a while, but had chosen not to tell me. It had been getting worse, the stress of Vanessa's situation accelerating everything. My mother's voice wavered as she spoke, the weight of it finally breaking through. She was exhausted. She couldn't handle everything on her own. She needed help. She needed me. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just about Vanessa anymore. This wasn't just another cycle of my parents bailing her out. This time, the stakes were different. The cost was different. I had spent my whole life resisting the role they had tried to force on me. The fixer. The responsible one. The one who sacrificed for the sake of the family. I had built my life on independence, on drawing firm boundaries, on refusing to be pulled into Vanessa's orbit. But now, the decision I had been so sure of, the refusal I had clung to, felt impossible. My father's health, my mother's exhaustion, the burden they had taken on, one they were no longer capable of carrying. I had told myself I wouldn't be the solution this time, that I wouldn't let them make my life a fallback plan for Vanessa's recklessness. But fear had never been part of this family. And now, whether I liked it or not, I was running out of choices. The weight of my mother's words stayed with me long after I hung up the phone. My father was sick. My mother was overwhelmed. Vanessa and her family were suffocating them in that cramped house, making an already unbearable situation worse. The logic was simple. They needed me, and yet I couldn't bring myself to say yes. It wasn't just resistance. It wasn't just the years of frustration, of always being the one expected to fix things, to sacrifice for the sake of the family. It was something deeper, a quiet voice in the back of my mind warning me that if I opened my doors to Vanessa, even for a moment, I would never get my life back. But guilt is a powerful thing. It creeps in through the cracks, whispering that maybe, just maybe, I was being too harsh. My father's health wasn't something I could ignore. My mother's exhaustion was real. No matter how much resentment I harbored, no matter how much I wanted to stay out of it, I couldn't erase the simple truth that my parents had given me a life, raised me, done their best with what they had. Maybe they had favored Vanessa. Maybe they had let her get away with things they never would have allowed me. But they were still my parents, and they were struggling. I told myself I wasn't doing it for Vanessa. I was doing it for them. So I called my mother back. I told her I would think about it. I made it clear that this wasn't a yes, not yet, just a consideration, a discussion. I told her I needed to see things for myself before making any decisions. That was how I found myself pulling up to my parents' house that weekend, stepping into the chaos that had taken root inside. The house was unrecognizable. It had always been a quiet, orderly space, small but well-kept, a place where everything had its place. Now it felt like a war zone. Toys were scattered across the floor, clothes piled up in corners, half-packed suitcases spilling out onto the couch. The air was thick with tension, an undercurrent of exhaustion humming beneath every interaction. My mother looked worn down, dark circles under her eyes, her movements sluggish. My father, once so steady, seemed smaller somehow, as if the weight of everything was pressing him into the ground. And then there was Vanessa. She looked exactly the same. No signs of regret, no acknowledgement of the damage she had caused. She greeted me with open arms, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't spent months chasing a fantasy while the rest of us lived in reality. Damien barely looked up from his phone. The kids, oblivious to the stress radiating from the adults, ran wild through the house, laughing and shouting with the kind of careless energy only children can have. It was worse than I had imagined. I tried to talk to my mother alone, try to ask her how bad things really were. She waved me off at first, insisting they were fine, that they could handle it. But when I pressed, when I didn't let her deflect, the truth spilled out. My father's condition had worsened. The doctor's appointments were becoming more frequent. My mother was barely sleeping, stretched thin between taking care of him and dealing with Vanessa's family. Damien was useless, spending most of his time on his phone or out of the house, avoiding responsibility. Vanessa helped when it suited her, but more often than not, she treated the situation as if it were some temporary inconvenience rather than the disaster it truly was. They weren't just struggling, they were drowning. And that was when I realized the real problem. Vanessa had no intention of leaving. The way she talked about the future, the casual way she mentioned getting back on their feet, the way she ignored any discussions about finding a job or looking for a new place, it all pointed to one undeniable truth. She had found another safety net, another way to escape responsibility. She had no plan, no next step. She was waiting for someone else to figure out for her, and that someone was supposed to be me. I could feel the walls closing in, the inevitability of it all. If I didn't step in, my parents would break under the pressure. If I did step in, I would lose everything I had worked for. There was no good option, no easy way out. And that was when my mother, exhausted and desperate, made her final move. She didn't ask me to take them in. She asked me to take my father. The request knocked the air from my lungs. My mother couldn't do it anymore. She loved him, but the burden was too much. If I couldn't take Vanessa, then could I at least take my father? Just for a little while. Just until things settled down. Just until they figure out what to do next. The trap was closing. I could feel it tightening around me. If I said no, I would be leaving my father to suffer in that chaos, to spend his remaining time in a house that was suffocating him. If I said yes, I would be letting Vanessa win. Because if I took my father, my mother would still be stuck with Vanessa. The cycle would continue. The weight would shift, but the problem wouldn't go away. And then, for the first time, I wondered if that had been Vanessa's plan all along. Had she known my parents would crack under the pressure? Had she counted on them reaching a breaking point, on them being so overwhelmed that they would come to me for help? Had she orchestrated all of this, not consciously, maybe, but in the way she always did, by manipulating the situation until she got exactly what she wanted? Because if I took my father, it wouldn't just be temporary. He was sick. He needed care. This wasn't a short-term arrangement. This was permanent. And once he was gone, once my mother was no longer weighed down by his needs, what would stop Vanessa from staying there forever? I could see it all so clearly now. Vanessa had never needed my house. She needed my father gone. She needed my parents' home to be hers, free of obstacles, free of responsibilities. And she had played the game perfectly. I had walked into this thinking I was making a choice. But the truth was, I had never had one at all. I left my parents' house that evening feeling like I had walked into a trap disguised as a home. My mother's words replayed in my mind, the weight of them pressing down on me. Take my father, just for a little while, just until things settled down. As if things ever truly settled down with Vanessa in the picture. As if this wasn't part of something larger, something I'd been blind to for too long. The realization had hit me like a slap. Vanessa wasn't looking for a way out. She was looking for a way to stay. She had always found a way to mold the world around her, to turn chaos into opportunity, to ensure that no matter how reckless her decisions, she would never be the one to suffer the full consequences. This time was no different. If I took my father in, she would win. The house would be hers. My mother would be too relieved to question it. And in the end, Vanessa would do what she always did. Take what she wanted and leave someone else to clean up the mess. I spent the next few days in a haze, caught between duty and fury, guilt and clarity. I loved my father. That was never in question. The thought of him spending his remaining time in that suffocating house, surrounded by the chaos of Vanessa's irresponsibility, was unbearable. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all by design. My mother, worn down and desperate, had reached for the only solution she could find. But it wasn't the right one. And then something happened that changed everything. A call from the hospital. My father had collapsed. The news hit me like a wrecking ball. I barely remembered the drive there, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. By the time I arrived, my mother was already there, her hands shaking as she clutched her purse, her eyes darting around the sterile waiting room like she was trying to hold herself together. Vanessa was there too, but her face was unreadable, too composed, too unaffected. The doctor told us it had been coming for a while. Stress, exhaustion, an untreated condition that had worsened under the weight of everything. He would need full-time care now, something beyond what my mother could provide. The words barely registered as I watched my mother crumble under the weight of it. And then, just as I had feared, Vanessa spoke. She turned to my mother, her voice soft, reasonable, laced with concern. She spoke of how hard it had been for my mother to take care of him. She reminded her of how exhausted she was, how impossible it would be to continue like this. And then, with a carefully measured sigh, she said it. Maybe it was time to consider other options. A nursing home. The words sent a jolt of cold rage through me. I watched as my mother hesitated, the exhaustion in her eyes making her vulnerable. And that was when I understood. This had been the plan all along. Not mine. Not my mother's. Vanessa's. She had never wanted my father in my house. She had wanted him out of hers, out of the picture entirely. The final obstacle standing between her and a home that she could claim as her own. And she had timed it perfectly. Let the pressure build. Let my mother break under the weight of it. And then offer the only solution that would benefit her. She had known. She had known this would happen. I saw it all with a clarity that made my skin crawl. She had played the long game. Let things deteriorate to the point where my mother was too drained to fight back. And now, she was gently guiding my mother toward the decision that worked best for her. Not for my father. Not for my mother. For her. I looked at my mother then, really looked at her, and I saw the doubt flickering behind her exhaustion. She was tired. She was broken. She didn't want to send him away, but she also didn't know what else to do. And Vanessa, selfish, manipulative Vanessa, was ready to make the decision for her. I couldn't let it happen. For the first time in years, I stepped in, not as the bystander, not as the responsible daughter who was expected to clean up after everyone else, but as someone who refused to let Vanessa take any more than she already had. I told my mother she wasn't putting him in a home. Not yet. Not when she was being pressured into it. Not when it was being forced on her by someone who had everything to gain. My father deserved more than that. He deserved a choice. He deserved dignity. And that was when I saw something flash across Vanessa's face. Not concern. Not worry. Annoyance. Frustration. Because for the first time, her plan wasn't working. But she wasn't done yet. She shifted tactics, softening her voice, turning to me instead. She spoke about how difficult it would be to take him in, how much my life would change, how overwhelming it would be. She framed it as concern for me, as though she was suddenly worried about the burden I would have to carry. But I saw it for what it was, a final attempt to make me back down. I didn't. I told my mother I would take him, not because Vanessa had won, but because my father deserved better than to be discarded like an inconvenience. I would figure it out. I'll make it work. But he wasn't going into a home just because it was easier for Vanessa. She didn't argue after that. Not outright, but I saw the calculation in her eyes, the quiet understanding that she had lost this round. But something told me she wasn't finished yet, because Vanessa never lost. She just found another way to win. Bringing my father home should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. Not yet. It felt like holding my breath, waiting for the next move, waiting for the inevitable. Because I knew Vanessa, knew the way she operated. She had spent her entire life twisting circumstances in her favor, warping reality to suit her needs. And this time, I had done something she hadn't expected. I had stopped her. For the first few weeks, things were quiet. Too quiet. I settled my father into my home, adjusted to the new routine. It wasn't easy. His health was worse than I had realized. His body was slowing down, his energy waning. He had always been the steady one, the quiet presence in the background of my life, but now he felt like a shadow of that man. The illness had hollowed him out, chipped away at his independence, leaving him tired in a way that wasn't just physical. He didn't complain, but I could see it, the way he looked past me sometimes, like he was already preparing to leave. My mother called often, guilt thick in her voice. She visited when she could, though never for long. Vanessa, of course, stayed away. She never acknowledged what had happened, never spoke about how close she had come to getting her way. Instead, she pretended as though she had always supported the decision, as though she had never suggested otherwise. It was classic Vanessa. If she couldn't win, she would rewrite history until it looked like she had never been trying to win in the first place. But I knew better, and I knew it wasn't over. The first sign came in whispers, small things, little details that didn't add up. My mother, distracted on the phone, hesitant when I asked about Vanessa. My father, sighing when he thought I wasn't listening. Then came the neighbors, casual comments laced with something more. They had seen my mother selling things, small things at first, then bigger ones. A few pieces of jewelry, a set of dishes that had been in the family for years, even an old painting that had hung in their house for as long as I could remember. At first, I thought she was just struggling, that maybe the burden of caring for my father had left her financially strained. But then I looked deeper, and what I found made my blood run cold. The house was no longer in my parents' name. I checked the records twice, 3 times, thinking there had to be a mistake. But there it was in black and white. A transfer, a change of ownership. The house, my parents' house, the house they had lived in for decades, was now legally owned by Vanessa. She had won after all. I sat in stunned silence, staring at the documents, trying to piece together how she had done it. And then I saw it, the pattern so obvious in hindsight. She had waited. She had let my mother break under the pressure. And then, when she was at her weakest, she had offered a solution, a way to ease the burden. Selling the house had probably seemed like a relief to my mother. One less thing to worry about, one less responsibility. And Vanessa had been right there, ready to take it off her hands. But she hadn't just bought the house. She had taken it. I confronted my mother, my voice calm, measured. I asked her if she had meant to give Vanessa everything, if she had truly believed this was the best option. And the way she looked at me told me everything I needed to know. She hadn't realized what she was doing. Vanessa had framed it as a temporary arrangement, something to help with the bills, something that would make things easier. She had promised my mother that she and Damien would stay for now, just until they got back on their feet. And my mother, desperate and exhausted, had believed her. I could have fought it. I could have argued, taken legal action, tried to untangle the web of deception Vanessa had spun. But my mother had signed the papers willingly. There was no fraud, no coercion, just manipulation so subtle, so expertly executed, that by the time my mother realized what had happened, it was too late. Vanessa had taken everything. I should have been furious. I should have been ready to storm into that house and tear her world apart. But instead, I felt something else. A quiet understanding. Vanessa had always been Vanessa, and this had always been inevitable. So I did the one thing she never expected. I let go. I walked away. I focused on my father, on making his remaining time as comfortable as possible. I focused on rebuilding my own life, one that no longer revolved around the chaos of Vanessa's decisions. And slowly, the resentment started to fade. Because in the end, I had won something too, something she would never understand. Freedom. Vanessa had a house now, but it came with my mother, with the burden of responsibility she had spent her whole life running from. She had trapped herself in the very thing she had once abandoned. And one day, when my mother grew older, when the weight of caring for another person became too much, Vanessa would realize the truth. She had finally gotten what she wanted, and she would never be able to escape it.